Well, good evening everyone. Thanks for David and Fiona for having me. Today I want to talk about how we basically use Sass news. We've got a very large code base. Over time it's just sort of really grown complex. We're almost hoarding CSS, layer upon layer of code. And so today I want to sort of talk about how we use it basically at work. Okay, so 15 months ago, we sort of kicked off a project to basically work more closely with the business and product to basically realize their ideas around different enhancements that they want to do to the sites, that sort of stuff, but we had a major problem. Our legacy code base distributed across many different teams. We went from a centralized model to a decentralized model, back and forth, until essentially it ended up back with the core network team. Lots of duplication, very hard to actually roll out network features. And so we basically had a plan. We couldn't sort of survive any longer with that sort of setup. So what we did, well, some numbers. We basically have around 500 individual sort of CSS files littered across our code base, doing very different things. Used across multiple different sites, but in reality what that actually meant was 75% of the code that we actually had around the network wasn't actually written by the network team, which is crazy when we have to roll out network features to those sites. So with that in mind, we decided to explore other opportunities in terms of how we could actually wrangle that code back together. How could we make it more organized? How could we make the code work for us as opposed to trying to fight with it each time? So we decided to use Sass. Now tonight, I'm not going to talk about all of this. There's only one thing specifically that I want to talk about this evening, and that is variables. We use variables extensively with what we're building at the moment, and we use it a core part of our theming that we do. When we develop new sites, it becomes more of a configuration management piece. So we have basically our base sort of set of components, our base sort of boilerplates that are all purely driven by configuration files. And what that means is it's very easy for us to actually react to changes. If we want to introduce a new section or a new component, we can quite easily integrate it into the existing sort of core of the site. So, like I said, I want to talk more about variables. Variables are great. We use them a lot. But if you don't have variables work, you are going to have a bad time with Sass. In the early days, just as we were sort of getting comfortable with it and just figuring out how it was working, it was a little bit of a learning curve for some of the developers that didn't understand how Sass would work. They may not have come from like a JavaScript programming background, they're just purely sort of CSS folks, and so this sort of concept was kind of a little bit alien to them using variables. And so you've basically got to, if you understand them, they can work well for you. So variables in Sass have this sort of concept of a guided assignment. So what it means is if you're building individual components, like a module that is maybe it's a breaking news module or a tab, you can basically provide it with a subset of default variables and provide those with default values. And what that means is in this example, just assume that these two variables defined here are in separate files. Essentially, I have a box, and the box by default has a color of blue. Now, as we go about theming things, we actually want the box to be red. And so we have our config file where we basically define that the box should be red. And essentially we end it like that. So what's actually happening is blue is basically ignored and red is basically applied to our box for our CSS. Thing to be mindful of, they're mutable, so you can overwrite them. So one thing that you also have to be careful of is using global variables inside your functions or inside your mixins. It's important to ensure that there's not necessarily a sort of a scope link with those variables. You need to make sure that you're using them appropriately. so that they aren't overridden unexpectedly. And as your code base grows very large, it's hard to sometimes keep track of where those overridings are occurring. So it's important to be mindful of that. Each slide has got an example at the bottom, so I'm going to be putting the slides online after this, so you'll be able to see some real examples of this code online as well. If you don't namespace your variables, you're going to have a bad time as well. It's really important that you sort of convey meaning with your variables. If you've got variables in a configuration file that's far removed from your component, it's good to understand where it's likely to be used, so you can actually understand basically where it would be cascading and used from. So generally what I like to do, I like to sort of use a sort of specific sort of pattern where I basically sort of group them based on the type that they are. So again, another example, individual sort of component files. I've got my module and I've got my box, but each of them are actually using the same variable to basically define their font sizes. Now, what if you actually want a module to have its own sort of font size, or if you want to have a box to have its own font size? With this, essentially setting a base font size of 18 pixels will actually apply to your module, to your box. So it's important to sort of, when you want to have that degree of customization, to namespace where appropriate, just to make it easier to basically theme individual components if you maintain like a large network of sites. Okay, so here's probably an approach that I'd probably use, just sort of simplified just for purpose of this, but you can see immediately that I've namespaced my variables to be module-based font size, box-based font size, and it's immediately obvious as well that in this configuration file, these variables are actually going to affect these components that I actually have within my code. You'll probably see this pattern quite a lot if you use Compass, and you're basically installing Compass plugins. If you're using like frameworks like Sass and that sort of stuff, they have sort of appropriately namespaced variables as well. Helps you sort of have a good understanding where they're used. Potentially, you could add an additional prefix, which you can describe by the site. Like it could be like daily telegraph, module, post, and that sort of stuff to describe that as being useful. If you make everything a variable, you can have a bad time as well. When I see code like this, it's sort of really sort of freaks me out, because it's like, yeah, we've got flexibility for making everything configurable, but what real value is there in making everything configurable? Do we need everything to be configurable at this point in time? I would only choose to make everything configurable if there's like an obvious need. In the early days of the projects that we were working on, the trend that we had was to make everything configurable, and that was largely due because we didn't necessarily have any idea of the designs that we were working with, so we kind of were trying to preempt designs so that would make it easy to, potentially that would maybe take maybe half an hour into maybe like a 2-minute change, that sort of stuff. So use them with proportion. Yeah, another pattern I've seen is using variables to assign values to other variables. I find that sort of introduces a complexity when it comes to making things portable. If you're using variables in this fashion, you've obviously got to, you've got to figure out you've got to go up the stack to figure out where the actual core variable is being used, and it could become a maintainability issue. So I'd only use it sparingly. And if you find that you're doing something like that, I'd probably suggest that you maybe look to refactor the use of variables. I think the trade-off of making something have a static value as opposed to a variable value is negligible. So yeah, use it with caution. Or with time. Cool. So if you sort of, variables are great and they sort of allow you to essentially provide or a means of introducing a variation. So here's an example of something that we've been working on to basically start off with a core base foundation of configurable components to allow us to introduce variations. Now, as you can see, each of the sites on the right, they've got a similar sort of structure, but from an aesthetics point of view, they're quite different. I mean, the Australian is probably very different. Those of you that have worked in news before, and I see a few of you in the room, you know, the Australian are very sort of precious about their brand, and so that was sort of a consideration as part of the development for the framework that we use to basically cater to their needs, to provide as much customization as we can. Next slide. Again, just another example. We also do mobile sites. So what it allowed us to do is it allowed us, using variables, to essentially keep branding consistent across the different channels that we support. So you can basically define the aesthetics for a site, the colors, even things like individual verticals that are used. I mean, we have this concept of verticals in news where we have like your entertainment vertical, your sports vertical, that sort of stuff. And branding is very important to keep that consistent across the network. So if you extract that out into a variable, what that then means is if for some reason we decide to rebrand entertainment to go from purple to lime green, we could potentially just change the configuration file, rebuild the CSS, and have that change cascade throughout the network. Very easy. We're not having to touch multiple CSS files to actually manage that. It's predictable. We can make a change in one place and have that cascade throughout the sort of network of sites. So we actually, all in all, we basically launched 32 sites over the course of a year. That's basically 16 desktop sites and 16 mobile sites. So that's quite a lot of effort that's gone into that, and credit to the team that worked on that. The team sort of grew and sort of shrunk over that sort of 12 months, and now we basically have 2 core developers that are responsible for working on the framework that we have. And this gives you a bit of insight in terms of the major releases that we actually had over the course of that year. As you can see, early on when we were developing the framework, there was like quite a large gap between major releases. That's as we were sort of working with the individual sites to understand the changes that they wanted. Although these are listing major releases, there's actually sort of small incremental releases like bug fixes, minor enhancements that are going on in between that. As you can see, as we sort of went through, the time to actually start introducing new sites became less and less, which is really great for us because it basically, if you go back to this sort of whole notion of the configuration management piece, if like 90% of the changes that you need to make are just basically changing variables, you can actually devote more time to working on the more interesting things, the things that are really challenging, that provide more enjoyment. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah. So, I mean, in the new year, we're going to continue basically going back over what we've already built, continue refactoring. What we found is that we decided not to optimize as we go. Well, let me rephrase that. We optimized when appropriate. It wasn't an immediate sort of goal to optimize. We were playing around with Sass, we were experimenting, seeing how it worked, and then we used tools like the Chrome developer tools, the audit tools to get an understanding in terms of how the CSS was working, refactoring where appropriate. We found using extends to not be the greatest thing for sort of keeping sort of selectors length down, so we started removing that. But we're continually optimizing the code, and it's easy to do that because when it comes to reacting to the business's needs, we can quite easily accommodate that. It's not such a stretch. We don't have to take a week, 2 weeks to make a small change. We deploy every Thursday now, and we deploy every day to our staging environments. So we're quite easy to react to changes. What's the next slide? So variables are great. But if some of the new things in Sass were available at the time, we probably would have changed how we approach things a little bit. And one of the really cool things to come out recently are maps with Sass. So those of you with like a JavaScript background or understand JSON, maps kind of provide like a data structure which is similar to that, which allows you to sort of define key value pairs of information, and they're really useful. I want to show you an example now. This is how we basically manage branding. As you can see, we've basically got three sort of separate variables at play that are basically describing accent colors, the vertical names, the vertical accents, that sort of stuff. And all we want to do is basically give a module header a color, but we've basically got to write a custom Sass function that essentially synchronizes all these variables together based on their indexes. It seems hacky, as it says, create a hacky lookup. And so some of the things that we'll be exploring in the new year is how can we actually go back to things like this and actually improve how we actually use them. One of the things that we were looking at is using sort of Sass maps. So here we have our verticals. News is blue, sport is green, and business is grey. Just want to illustrate how easy it is to basically override values for a site by using a Sass map merge. And I've got no functions at play. I'm just literally iterating around the list and basically building my CSS. Much cleaner, less room for sort of error, having these variables that are around all the place. What are they doing? Colors and the vertical name are basically together, and it's happy that's what I do. So what do I have next? If you're not really using it, you probably shouldn't use Compass. That is something that I kind of regret early on, is immediately sort of deciding to use Compass. One of the reasons that I was really decided to use it was mainly for the sprite generation. If you take the sprite generation away, you could basically write your own mixins to do like CSS3 and that sort of stuff. You don't necessarily need to bolt on Compass on top of that. And probably what we look to do in the new year is basically remove our dependency on Ruby that we have by introducing Compass and move to maybe libsass and use that by node. So then that way we can have these sort of self-contained builds. So Compass is great, but I'd say use it when you need to use it, not just use it because it's there. Yeah. The next slide is something that I was in two minds about including, and something that I've found is if your code base is really large, sometimes you might reach a pivot point where what you want to do isn't necessarily possible with Sass. And what I'm sort of thinking about, and the example that I'm sort of talking about that is when it comes to sort of managing things like feature toggles. So one of the things that we have with our sites is we could have a site that could have a tabber, let's say, and that's used maybe 5 sites, and maybe the Australian doesn't want to even use that tabber at all. We don't want to employ in the core tabber. What we're probably going to be looking at doing in the new year is introducing a concept of feature toggling, where we can basically define feature toggles as part of a grunt.js build to basically automatically generate variables. And those same variables also generate a JavaScript file that also allows us, if we turn off the tabber, we also turn off the JavaScript, and we also turn off the CSS. So then where we get that synchronization. So that's something that you could probably manage with Sass, but because we want to work with JavaScript as well, we look to moving it outside of Sass. And there's a grunt plugin called Grunt Feature that can help you out with that on GitHub. It's where I wrote it, so what's next? Yeah, so that's the end of my talk. Get me on GitHub, Twitter. I write a few plugins that you can use to play around with CSS. Like Style Guide for abstracting using KSS Node or Style Docker. Print Feature for managing feature toggles, that sort of stuff. And We're also hiring for these, so if you're interested, come speak to me.